各位同事，我哋呢個 OK 啊，使唔使？唔使搞。OK。
Members, it's the appointed time and we have a quorum. We now proceed to the video conference meeting of the panel on housing. I'd like to remind members that when you speak in the meeting, please activate the video function on the Zoom system and show your faces. And when taking part in a remote meeting, members must use the virtual background function of the Zoom system and use a specified color. Members returned by the election committee elections, please use orange. Members returned from the functional constituency elections, please use green. And members returned from the geographical constituency elections, please use purple. First item on the agenda, information paper issued since the meeting on the 25th of January. Since the last meeting, the information paper received by the Secretariat is listed on the agenda. Item number 2, items for discussion at the next meeting. The next regular meeting will be held on March the 7th, which is a Monday at 2:30 p.m. The administration proposes 2 discussion items. A review of public rental housing income and asset limits for 2021 to 22. B, the housing authorities projects utilizing the modular integrated construction approach and the design and build procurement model. If members agree, we shall proceed with discussion of these items at the next meeting. This month, together with the Deputy Chairman, I will meet the Secretary for Transport and Housing to discuss the work plan of the panel for the current session. We will inquire the administration on when the proposed discussion items raised by members last time will be included on the meeting agendas. Number 3, proposals to appoint subcommittee on policy issues. The panel received 2 proposals. First, the recommendation to form a subcommittee on issues relating to the improvement of living conditions of the grassroots tenants by Mr. Vincent CHENG and Dr. Hon Vincent suggested the formation of a subcommittee on the comprehensive review of the public housing development process. Both members included the proposed terms of reference, work plan, and schedule in their letters to the panel. Do members support these proposals by the 2 members? So I assume that members support the formation of these 2 subcommittees. The House Committee will collect recommendations made by different panels before considering the formation of these proposed subcommittees. Now we move on to the next item on the agenda. The Chief Executive's 2021 Policy Address. In order to allow members to speak in an orderly and fair manner, could our staff please help clear the raise hand markers of the members? Members who intend to speak, please use the raise hand function in the Zoom system. I would invite members to speak in turn. I welcome Secretary for Transport and Housing and other officials to the video conference meeting. I invite the Secretary to brief us on the housing initiatives under the policy address. I understand a slideshow will be presented. I call upon the Secretary to be succinct when he speaks, so we have more time for members to ask questions. Chairman, this is the first time we attend the panel on housing meeting since the formation of the 7th Legislative Council. We are happy to see many new faces as well as long-standing partners. On October the 6th last year, the Chief Executive delivered her 2021 policy address. Today, I will brief members on the latest progress on the main housing-related initiatives under the policy address and the implementation progress, including the Long-Term Housing Strategy Annual Progress Report 2021 announced on December the 8th last year. Meanwhile, we would also consult members on the proposal to inject $3.3 billion into the funding scheme to support transitional housing projects by NGOs. To tackle the housing shortage, consistently developed land, increasing housing supply is the most fundamental approach. The current term administration has been seeking land to increase housing supply. According to the policy address, the government has identified 350 hectares of land to build about 330,000 public housing units to satisfy the public housing demand of 301,000 in the 10-year period from 2022 to 2023 to 2031 to 2032. Since the long-term housing strategy was established in 2014, we have been projecting housing demand based on the mechanism and objective data from the LTHS. According to the report, the total housing demand for the 10-year period from 2022 to 2023 to 2031 to 2032 is about 422.8 thousand units, and as such, the government set the supply target at 430,000. According to 70 to 30 mix of public and private housing supply, the public housing supply target is 301,000, and the private housing supply target is 129,000. Among public housing, the supply target for PLH and GSH is 210,000, while other subsidized sale flats is 91,000. For details of such projections, please refer to the report in Annex 1 to the paper. The Government Housing Authority and Housing Society have been working hard to complete the construction of more units as soon as possible. According to forecasts in December last year, it is expected that the HA and HS will come up with a total public housing production of 106.8 thousand in the 5 years from 2021 to 2022 to 2025 to 2026, including 73,000 PLH and GSH units and about 33.8 thousand other SSFs. For details, please refer to Annex 2 to Annex 4. As for the public housing projects completed in 2026 to 2027 and beyond, most are still at the land production stage, and the schedule is affected by many factors, including rezoning, resumption of land, infrastructure construction, land formation, etc. The various government departments will actively pursue the relevant work in order to complete the required procedures for land development. In order to complete more units as soon as possible, the policy address pointed out that the HA and the HS will more extensively use the modular integrated housing approach and other new construction technologies. So far, the HA has adopted MIC in 3 projects, providing about 2,000 units. The HA has also identified other projects in which MIC could be adopted, and it is expected to provide about 20,000 units. In some public housing projects of the HA, a 90% precast rate on plan has been achieved and is able to build a typical floor with over 20 public housing units in 6 days. The HA will also adopt a new procurement model in appropriate projects and to introduce a design and build approach for contractors to increase housing production. The policy address also mentioned the redevelopment of aged public housing estates. The HA has been considering, based on the current policy and actual circumstances, whether to redevelop aged housing estates, and there are 8 redevelopment projects, including Patin Estate, Older Portion, Meitong Estate, Older Portion, and Wafu Estate. And the Shackley interim housing will be demolished for public housing purposes, and 4 factory estates under the HA will be redeveloped. Since Saiwan Estate and Matawai Estate have appropriate rehousing resources and in situ redevelopment could potentially supply more units, the HA will study the redevelopment of these two old housing estates under appropriate circumstances and strive to include adjacent areas in development. The government also looks to enrich the housing ladder. In 2022, the HA will make available 8,900 HOS units and about 4,700 GFS units to prevent short-term speculative activities. On January the 6th, the HA approved to tighten the alienation restriction for HOS and GFS units, and that is the restriction of not selling the units at not higher than the original price in the secondary market to from 2 years to 5 years since first assignment, and from 10 years to 15 years since first assignment for selling the units in the open market after paying the premium. And in the meantime, to improve those living in inadequately housed households, 3 breakthroughs have been achieved by the government in recent years. First, transitional housing. The PA proposed increasing the number of units in the coming years to 20,000 and to increase the funding on the pilot scheme on use of hotels and guest houses as transitional housing from $8.3 billion to $11.6 billion. Today, we hope to hear the views of members on the $3.3 injection to the funding program. For details, please refer to Annex 5. Meanwhile, in June 2021, the government has launched the 3-year cash allowance trial scheme to provide cash allowance to eligible PRH general applicant households in order to alleviate the hardships they face due to prolonged waiting for PRH. As of the end of December last year, we have disseminated the cash allowance to almost 67,000 eligible general applicant households. The third measure is to implement tenancy control on subdivided flats. The relevant legislation was in force since the 22nd of January without unduly compromising the interests and private property rights of landlords. These measures can provide security of tenure for tenants, restrict the increase of rents upon renewal, and to prevent overcharging of public utility fees. In order to enhance governance, the PA also proposed the importance of reorganizing the government structure, and 5 preliminary plans were floated. Upon 3 months of internal discussion and having referred to the views of stakeholders at the Chief Executive question and answer session at LESCO on January the 12th, the CE indicated that the current term government has drafted a detailed reorganization plan. It is proposed that the Transport and Housing Bureau would be split, and the Housing Bureau would be fully in charge of the housing portfolio and to be supervised by the Financial Secretary. The Financial Secretary, who is currently Chairman of the Steering Committee on Land Supply, will enhance coordination between the Housing Bureau and Development Bureau. And today, Doris Ho, head of the Policy Innovation and Coordination Office, is in attendance to take in members' views on the reorganization. We promise that the government will implement the new measures proposed by the policy address to support the housing needs for more Hong Kong families. We hope to work sincerely with members, and hopefully our work would be understood and supported by members and the public. Thank you very much. More than 10 members indicated that they would like to speak. Since we have a second item on the agenda today, I would limit the speaking time to 4 minutes each. I would read out the names first. Mr. Michael Tian, Dr. Hon Vincent, Dr. Lo Wai Kwok, Mr. Edward Lau, Mr. Lee Chun Kang, Mr. Stanley Ng, Dr. Hong Wen, Mr. Lokoman, Mr. Chen Hoffman, Mr. Leung Man Kwan, Mr. Kitson Yang, Mr. Chen Yong, Ms. Doreen Kong, Ms. Sari Lee, and myself. Mr. Michael Tian, 4 minutes each, please. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, can you hear me? Yes. Fine. Secretary, last year the CE delivered her policy address, saying that housing is for accommodation rather than for speculation. You have just said that you're going to tighten up the restrictions for the subsidized housing. Well, I don't think subsidized housing should be for sale in the free market. Otherwise, you are creating a market for speculation. The government should consider the following. If someone would like to sell his or her subsidized housing, it should be returned to the government. Now, for transactions over such subsidized flats, I think there should be a capital gain tax. But I don't think the government is considering this. So my proposal is that for the resale of subsidized flats, they could only be sold to somebody who is equally eligible. I don't think what you are doing is in line with the CE's principle, that is, properties or housing is for accommodation rather than speculation. Now, for Chengpo House, as a result of the poor design of the drains, there has been the spread of the infection. It is not news. It is said that by March 2022 or 21, you would have rectified all the drainage pipes of public housing blocks. Now we're in the year 2022, so can you give us an update on the progress? Secretary. Well, I think many citizens would like to see no speculation in the property market. But at the same time, for properties, other than playing a social role, there's also the function of being a tool of investment. Citizens, many of them, may, owing to one reason or other, say like there is a change in his means of living or his other circumstances, may have to sell his subsidized flat. So there's a need to allow for the sale of subsidized flats. On different occasions, we've been consulting the public views, including members' views. It is said that it is important to allow for the transactions of subsidized flats. And then there has been a discussion about imposing a capital gains tax. As to the rectification of drainage systems, indeed, the Housing Authority has carried out an inspection of all the drains and pipes. Regarding the vent at the rooftop, it has been installed in accordance with the requirements of the Buildings Department. When the Buildings Department is to amend the law, the Housing Bureau will render full support. Mr. Tian, back to the pipes. Does it mean that you have already rectified all the pipes for all the public housing blocks? Basically, for those on the external walls, they are in line with the prevailing legal requirements. In special circumstances, if we need to go beyond what is statutorily required, we are ready to do so. So let's hope that we won't have a repetition of what happened in Chai Wan Estate. Well, as to whether properties are for accommodation or for speculation, I think the only conclusion would be that it should be sold back to the government or someone equally eligible. I don't think your arguments are sound. I don't think your arguments can convince me. What you're doing would only generate speculation. Sorry, Mr. Tian, your time is up. Many other members are queuing up. I'm sure this point will be picked up by other members. Next, Dr. Wong. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Secretary. I've got 3 questions. They are all related about the production volume. In 2014, the long-term housing strategy was first promulgated, but I'm afraid the production is always behind the supply target. We have accumulated a huge amount of demand, so it is indeed worrying to see delays in the meeting of production targets. According to your paper, when we compare what we get this year with what we got last year, we can see that 19% of the public housing and GSH, as well as 26% of HOS blocks are experiencing delays. and there are altogether 11 such projects. So the case is worse than what we got last year. For the 11 projects, tell us the reasons of delay. Tung Chung Area 99 should produce 4,800 flats, and then 1,900 flats in Sha Tin, and they have all experienced delays. And then, do you have measures to make sure that there would be no further delays among such public housing projects? Such delays would lengthen the waiting time by how much, please? Secretary, 3 questions. Thank you, Madam Chair. If I may ask our Deputy Director, Mr. Leung, to tell you about public housing production. Mr. Stephen Leung. Thank you, Madam Chair. Regarding the production, we do have changes for the 5-yearly figures. They will fluctuate, so it will be difficult to comment whether we get more this year and fewer next year. As to what Dr. Wong referred to, like changes in the completion dates. Well, first of all, we are affected by the elements. In most cases, inclement weather will result in a change of the completion date. And then we will adopt the financial year as the completion date or completion year. So when we say that a project is to be completed in the next financial year, it doesn't mean that it will be delayed by 1 full year. As a result of the wet weather, we may have to get 1 or 2 extra months to complete the project. Dr. Wong talked about Area 99 in Tung Chung. For that particular site, we encountered unique geotechnical circumstances unforeseen at the commencement of the project. As the project was underway, we found that it was very difficult to carry out the piling work. So we had to change the locations of the piles, and as a result, there has been an impact on the completion date. So basically, we are affected by inclement weather, or we have unforeseen geotechnical circumstances, and they all prolong the duration. The second question was about the delays as a result of unforeseen circumstances. Yes, it does have an impact on the allocation of flats, but then our housing department staff will do their best. If there are special circumstances or the weather is unfavorable, we'll try to compress the time taken so as to speed up the public housing production. But sometimes we are not able to deal with it, and I hope we have your understanding. Thank you. Next, Dr. Lu Wai-Kwok, to be followed by Eva Lau. Thank you, Madam Chair. 3 questions here. First of all, for the 10-year housing production program, of course, we are all clear about that. We always talk about 300,000 or 300,000 plus. For the first 5 years, we'll only get 1/3 of them. That is, only 1/3 of them is subject to a more concrete timetable. For the rest, they're still at the land formation stage. I think we still want to have more specifics. Therefore, I'm unhappy. For the second 5 years, the administration is not able to tell us more about the specific programs. You need to form the site, and then you build the blocks. And of course, it will take more time, and such will come within the second 5 years. But still, it is important. I'm a member of the Building Committee of the Housing Authority, and even I myself can only get information about the first 5 years. This is most unsatisfactory. If you haven't got such figures, how can you convince the public that 10 years down the road there will be an improvement in the supply of public housing flats? The second point, I want to support the idea of transitional housing. It is good for you to set aside more resources to provide more transitional housing. For the early projects of transitional housing, I think they have become a laughing stock. They spend the first 2 years to go through the procedures, spend 1 year on construction, and then tenants can only stay there for 2 years before they get a public rental flat allocated. They have to leave the transitional housing. So I think you better compress the time taken to go through the procedures. Otherwise, the good idea cannot really address the housing issue. And then for the reorganization of the government structure, yes, you would like to improve the situation. Now, we have the THB. We have the Transport and Housing Bureau taking care of 2 chunks, and you're not able to coordinate the different issues. Public housing is ready in Tongzheng, but then you haven't got another MTR station to serve the population. So when you split transport from housing, then it will be even more difficult for you to coordinate among or with other bureaus. Secretary, for the 10-year long-term housing strategy, please go to Appendix 2. Yes, we have got a lot of details for the first 5 years. This is because for the subsidized housing and the public rental housing blocks, they are under construction. For the second half of the 10-year period, we are still going through the procedures, land formation, etc. So 2 weeks ago, at a Q&A session by the CE, I think we have got some answers from Mr. Michael Wong as well. So we have got details regarding the first 5 years. Or rather, when Mr. Michael Wong answered a question at an electrical meeting, he gave you the reasons why it was so. Maybe I can get my colleague to see if he can supplement. Mr. Yao, please. As mentioned in the paper, for the second 5 years, indeed, we are still at the advanced stage, like land resumption, infrastructure provision, or land clearance, etc. So when projects are at such stages only, it would not be easy to be accurate about the volume of production. We are going to streamline the development process. Say, for example, we are amending the relevant laws to see whether we can streamline the planning process. In this way, we can expedite the early part of the procedures, and then perhaps in future, we are able to be more specific about the second 5 years. In other words, they're still not able to give us the information. I think we're pressed for time, so it's better to leave it for other members to pick up the same point. Lau. Thank you, Madam Chair. The Secretary said that he had already identified the demand for the next 10 years. For the 10-year housing program, I want to know when the government is able to achieve the 3-year waiting time target. Now, for the projects for the first 5 years, they're under construction. For the second 5 years, why don't you increase the plot ratio and speed up the pace? I'm sure you can have 50,000 units a year, and then you can catch up with your targets, and then you can shorten the average waiting time back to 3 years. So do you have a timetable to achieve such a target? And then for the housing ladder, for the HA and the HS, you have got different types of subsidized housing, like GSH and HOS, etc. Can you not relaunch the tenancy purchase scheme? I think for those who are sitting tenants, I think they would like to buy their own flats, and then they can get up the housing ladder and they can have adequate housing.
Secretary, in terms of housing production in the next 10 years, in the first 5-year period, there will be about 100,000 PRH and SSFs. And in terms of waiting time For public housing, we should see an obvious improvement in the second 5-year period. According to the target laid by the 10-year housing strategy, the housing needs, including the inadequately housed households, the demand is only about 430,000. So our housing production should be adequate. After the 10-year period, waiting time for PRH should be substantially improved. The government has indicated its wishes to enrich the housing ladder, including rental housing and SSFs. So the mix of rental to sale housing would be maintained at 70 to 30, and the number of subsidized sale flats would be about 129,000, and we are working towards this goal. Secretary, you always talk about substantial improvements and meeting the 10-year target, but in terms of the waiting time target of 3 years, this is a target that still exists. But you could not tell people when you can meet this target. Can you give us a specific timeline? Thank you very much for the question. The 3-year waiting time target has always been on the radar of the Housing Authority, because we have more than 150,000 households waiting for PRH. The public housing supply for the next 5 years is about 100,000. That is why we said we should see a more obvious improvement in the second 5-year period. This is a realistic target. And given the prolonged waiting time for PRH, we would provide support measures, including cash allowance, transitional housing, etc. Mr. Lau, I understand your wishes to reduce the PRH waiting time, but at the end of the day, it takes time to identify land for housing production. Mr. Li Shen-Kern, followed by Mr. Stanley. Thank you. First of all, I thank the Secretary for attending the meeting. Personally, I support the government reorganization, and hopefully this can help speed up the process of land and housing production. I have a few questions for the Secretary. In terms of the single site multiple uses approach, how can we do a better job in providing housing resources, and how we can put the sites into better use? For the future Housing Bureau, I'd like to know what their plans will be. Housing construction involves land, resources, and manpower. I'd like to talk about the second element. According to the slideshow, to speed up housing production, technologies including geographical information systems, big data, MIC, etc., will be adopted to speed up housing production. I'd like to know whether you will adopt more efficient and smarter technologies in the future to speed up the housing supply in order to meet the target. There were reports saying that housing production costs in Hong Kong ranked 3rd in the world among the big cities, which is a cause for concern. Would the government consider importing labor in order to lower housing production costs and speed up housing production? Finally, for public housing developments in the future, the relevant facilities should no longer be divested to private developers. Otherwise, the costs of the goods and services would go up to the detriment of the people. Thank you very much for your views. We do care about the welfare of PRH tenants, and that is why we strive to provide convenience for them in terms of the single site multiple users approach. And where possible, we would introduce welfare facilities comprising about 5% of the total GFA, and we will also have public and community facilities, and where possible, we will accommodate more public parking spaces. In terms of the import of labor, our stance is that if we adopt MIC, the manpower demands would be lower, and where possible, without jeopardizing the interests of local workers, that could be an idea, but our priority is always on the welfare of the local workers. For the other question, I would defer to my colleague. We are adopting different methods to speed up housing production, including the use of MIC. As the Secretary said, most of the parts are precast on the mainland, and we have achieved a precast rate of 90% on plan. We would expand the use of MIC so that more procedures could be completed on the mainland, and that would lower the demand on local workers. Meanwhile, we will use other construction technologies such as big data to facilitate the construction workflow and the process of oversight. Since time is limited, Mr. Leung, we would have to move on. Mr. Stanley Ng, followed by Dr. Wendy Hong. Mr. Ng. Secretary, many members talked about the promise of meeting the 3-year waiting time target. Apparently, this is something that could not be attained by the government, and this is certainly not good enough. Earlier, the Secretary said the target could only be met in 10 to 20 years, but in terms of your 10-year housing supply target of 330,000, can you eventually achieve the 3-year waiting time? And is this in line with your earlier target of 10 to 20 years? Do you need to identify more sites for public housing? In terms of tenancy control for SDUs, this is something proposed by the FTU. There should be a subsidy on rents, and why didn't you make this regular? In terms of the use of technology, are our workers capable of using new technologies in housing construction? If not, would the government reinforce training in this area? For workers who are not equipped with such knowledge, are you going to reinforce some training or retraining? In the next 10 years, the housing demand is about 340,000, and this is backed by objective data. And in theory, our housing production should satisfy the demand. So long as we follow the schedule and speed up our work, the waiting time situation should improve substantially. In terms of the cash allowance, we are running a 3-year trial scheme, and it will be reviewed at an appropriate juncture. As to whether we will make it regular, this is something we will consider down the road. In terms of the use of technology, we realize that Hong Kong's labor force will shrink due to population aging, So there's a need to adopt construction technologies. But we do understand that a number of grassroots workers would need to upgrade their skills, and that is why we would put in measures to train our workers. We will also be working with the Construction Industry Council on this, and we will also be working with the Development Bureau and our colleagues to upgrade the skills of construction workers so that they are more technology ready. Secretary. You didn't say that. Well, you didn't say whether the housing production target of 330,000 can help reduce the waiting time for PLH. Are you reluctant to make such promise, or is this not a concrete target? If you are determined, you should either make regular the rental subsidy. Can you commit on that, Secretary? On average, the waiting time for PLH is almost 6 years. 150,000 households are on the waiting list, and if we are able to house 150,000 families in the next 10 years, I believe with this target, the waiting time for PLH would be greatly reduced. Members, like I said at the beginning, at coming meetings, we will discuss the MIC and design and build procurement model. So for questions related to these technologies, you may ask them at coming meetings. And today, we can focus on the other issues. I see that many members have questions, and the Secretary did not have a chance to answer them in detail. Some questions asked whether they would be allowed to ask a second round of questions. If we do not have many more members asking questions for the first time, I might allow members to speak for a second time for 1 or 2 minutes each. But if we have a lot of members speaking for the first time, then a second round might not be possible. So if members want a detailed answer from the Secretary, please be brief in your questions. Next, Dr. Hong Wan, followed by Mr. Benson Look. Chairman, Secretary, I'd like to talk about transitional housing. Recently, I was in touch with some organizations, including charities, businesses, and charities who participate in public housing production. We conducted a survey, and we hope for an answer from the government. They said that the government's funding is inadequate, including the use of agricultural land in public housing. They need to develop standalone sewage systems, and the cost is a few dozen $1 million. So the current subsidy level of $50,000 per household is not enough. And they also complain about complex vetting procedures, including the areas of transport and environmental conservation, and the average vetting time is half a year. There's a project, and but the residents were concerned about feng shui. That is why the project stalled. For organizations who take part in the development of transitional housing are concerned that since we develop these housing in batches, we need to properly rehouse the residents 7 years later. and let's say a site will be put into other purposes 7 years later. If you are going to rehouse so many residents at the same time, can we get the land back for other purposes? So these are very real concerns. Hopefully the government can provide some feedback. Thank you.
Secretary, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Hong. I'm aware of the issues that she highlighted. Maybe I can defer to Professor So. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Hong, for your point. Regarding the financial subsidies, well, at the last LegCo session, we did consult your views. On the 4th of June 2020, we got LegCo's approval to raise the per unit subsidy to $565,000, in particular to deal with the drainage systems. On average, we spend $540,000 per unit. We'll try as much as possible to carry out cost saving and to be cost effective. We have a task force on transitional housing, and we are able to liaise with different government departments so as to deal with the bottlenecks in relation to approvals, and we also help in resolving the technical issues. You talked about the accessibility as well as other issues. We do try our best to make sure that everything can run smoothly. And of course, we do liaise with the local people. Just now you talked about the concern about feng shui. Well, in fact, the local people might have other views as well. The NGOs, the local people, and ourselves will have a lot of communication just to make sure that we can launch the projects smoothly. As to the rehousing of the tenants, we have carried out a lot of work in relation to selection as well as support measures. So all in all, please rest assured that there will be appropriate arrangements. Mr. Look, please. Thank you, Madam Chair. Having heard what other members have said and what the Secretary has said, I think the supply of public housing will still be tight for the next 10-20 years, and therefore transitional housing is still the answer for people having to live in SDUs and who have to pay a lot of rent. It is said that $3.3 billion more will be going to this project. It is said that in the year 2023, 10,000 transitional housing units will be made available, and in this year's policy address, it is said that the number will go up to 20,000. I think it's ambitious, but then it is said that we have only got 1,306 that are actually available, while 4,200 are still being built. There are only 2 more years to go before 2023. How come that you're going to make available 4 times the number of transitional housing units? Do you have a magic wand? For transitional housing, I don't think it should be incorporated into the 10-year long-term housing strategy. But then, if we don't have that incorporated into the 10-year program, then it is difficult for us to hold you accountable. Though the figures may fluctuate, but still, I hope the government can sort of have a dynamic target and try to review the figures annually, and then the public would have some hope and can see the light at the end of the tunnel. In 2018, when the policy address was delivered, it was said that there were 1,500 industrial buildings which could have been converted into transitional housing. We have heard nothing about that, though many SDUs have been developed therein. Would you like to do more in that direction? Are you going to convert IBs into transitional housing? can you not sort of extend the short-term waiver scheme? Instead of just 5 years, can you not prolong it to 10 years? That's for the planning department. And then are you going to provide incentives? I think when an IB has been converted into transitional housing, are you not able to consider favorably the payment of premium? Thank you, Mr. Loh. Well, when you go to Annex 5, we do have figures about transitional housing. As of now, more than 2,000 units are in operation. By middle of this year, there will be new projects with population intake for 4,000 units. By the middle of 2023, there will be 11,000 more. So 17,000 altogether will be available. We are seeking your support to inject more funding, and then we can launch more projects. As to the conversion of IBs into transitional housing, we welcome your idea, but then we have to bear in mind safety and other circumstances. For IBs to be converted into housing for domestic purposes, there are certain concerns, and perhaps we can consider having some incentives, but currently they do pose a challenge. We have a shortage of public housing. In the interim, transitional housing can provide a buffer, and then for inadequately housed households, it is also a sort of temporary solution, and I look forward to your support. Next, Mr. Chen Hock-Fung, to be followed by Mr. Lemon Guang, our Deputy Chair. Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary. Well, we have always been harping on the same issue of 3 years average waiting time for public housing. Is it a policy for the SAR government, or is it a policy for the housing authority? There is a difference. If it is a government's policy, then all policy bureaus should strive to achieve the target. If it is only the target on the part of the HA, then you can check the responsibility onto the HA. But I don't think the HA has regarded it as a policy target. In fact, the HA can allow the waiting time to fail the 3-year rule. So I wondered if the administration would adopt it as a policy target and have it incorporated into the long-term housing strategy to be reached in the long term. Now, whenever we talk about the LDHS, we always have the rolling figures. What I mean is that you always tell us that for the first 5 years, the supply will be tight, and please look forward to the next 5 years, there will be solutions. But why don't you sort of turn to page 1 of the paper? You talk about 2017, 18, 2021, 2022, saying that there will be 96,500 units within public housing within the current term government. But if you visit the website of the HA, we have so far only got 64,800, so 13,000 off the mark. Now you're trying to sort of roll forward all the figures, so all the shortfalls have always been swept under the carpet. So why don't you sort of tell us the figures year by year? I think by having it on a rolling basis, you're trying to pull wool over our eyes. Well, I'm with the Central Western District Council. We are going to redevelop the aged Saiwan estate. Just like in the case of Wafu, you need to have a site to rehouse the sitting tenants. So do you have do you have enough land to build the receiving estates? For Wafu, I think it will take a decade or 2. At the moment, you're simply felling the trees on the slope. So do you have sufficient rehousing resources? Secretary, thank you, Mr. Chen, for your ideas. Let me clarify one point. When we talk about public housing, we cover both rental as well as those for sale. So probably Mr. Chen got the figures concerning the rental units. Here we are talking about 30,000 subsidized flats for sale. And then we have got the figures from Housing Authority as well as the Housing Society. For the 3-year waiting time target, is it the government's target or the HA's target? Basically, this is HA's target. Well, we have this idea because we want to allocate a flat to the households as soon as possible. We hope the 3 years would be about right. I think you all understand that we are having a catching up game. In the past, it was difficult to get land for housing. As you can see, it will take no less than 10 years to find land and then eventually complete a housing block. For planning, land resumption, rezoning, whatnot will all be expedited. And the Development Bureau in the first half of this year will carry out a review of the procedures, hoping to streamline and expedite the process. And the HA would like to compress the time taken. We hope that in this way, public and private housing, in terms of planning, design, and building, everything can be expedited. Next, Mr. Leung Man Guang, to be followed by Mr. Yang Man Git. Mr. Leung, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank the Secretary as well. Just a few points from me. First of all, tenancy control for SDUs. It came into effect on the 22nd of January. Now, we know that for the tenancy control provisions, it seems that the public are not too familiar with them. And we have heard a lot of comments concerning the increase of rents. First of all, make sure that landlords and tenants understand better the new provisions. And then for the initial rent, I think you better start looking at that as well. And then for the 3-year average waiting time, here we're talking about the next 5 years, and according to the LTHCs, we are supposed to get 105,000 units per year. But then you would at most be getting 72,000, so you are 30,000 short. So when are you going to make good the shortage? If you can't make good the shortage, then it will be difficult for us to see that in 10 years or 10 plus years time, we can achieve the 3-year average waiting time target. The Secretary did talk about being able to do that in 10 years or 10 plus years. But if you are still 30,000 units behind your target, when are you going to catch up? Now, for people inadequately housed or those living in SDUs, I think they can only turn to transitional housing if they are not going to get a public rental unit in 3 years' time. Now, the Secretary said that he was confident that next year there will be 17,000 units. But then we are 32,000 units short of your target. And if you adopt transitional housing as a buffer, it means that there will be a few thousand units behind your target. So are you going to come back to get more money so as to boost your program for transitional housing so that you get more transitional housing flats so as to act as a buffer in case that you are not able to deliver on your public housing program? Secretary, I would like to thank Mr. Leung for his points regarding the 90,000 units. We are confident for the first 5 years. We are having projects that are already underway, so we are confident. As Mr. Leung, the DD, has said, there might be inclement weather and other factors, but still we are confident that we can deliver. I think the focus should be on the second 5 years. The projects are still undergoing statutory process, infrastructure, and other things. So we'd like to expedite that bit, hoping that the production can speed up. So our priority lies with the second 5 years. And then before we can catch up with the permanent public housing, we need to help those who are in difficulty, that is those inadequately housed, and therefore we have to work on the transition housing. So is cash allowance, so is tenancy control for SDUs. Mr. Leung referred to the tenancy control of SDUs. I would like to defer to Mr. Chen.
局長。
Thank you. In terms of enforcing the new legislation, we would promote the arrangements under the new legislation and the obligations and rights of landlords and tenants. The ratings and valuation department has set up a new unit with 50 staff members to educate the public on the legislation, and they will also answer public inquiries. They would also provide free mediation service. And we will also be collecting data on rents so that we could consider the idea of initial rents if necessary. The Transport and Housing Bureau also set up 50 community support teams to allow landlords and tenants to understand the new requirements. Through these district service teams, publicity would be carried out to allow tenants to understand the requirements under the new legislation. You can provide the answers in writing since time is limited. Mr. Michael Tian intends to speak for the second time. But since a number of members who are yet to speak are waiting to speak in the first round, I believe we will not proceed to a second round. Mr. Kitson Yang, followed by Mr. Chen Yong. Thank you. First, I'd like to talk about the HOS market. There's very little circulation in the market right now, and that leads to very high prices among HOS units. Could transactions between HOS owners be possible without paying a premium? And many HOS owners are reluctant to get rid of their units since they could not purchase a new unit without paying premium. So if these sellers are allowed to buy another HOS unit in the secondary market without paying a premium, then that would be conducive to the healthy development of the HOS market. And my second point is that I support the development of transitional housing because it can improve the living environment of tenants who are living in subdivided units. But in terms of identifying locations for transitional housing, you are met with opposition from many residents because you chose land that is planned for parks, etc., or education. So these sites should be should be developed into schools or parks, and yet they have been converted to transitional housing. I hope the government can pay more attention to that. The Secretary said they want to speed up the redevelopment of old housing estates. The progress has been far too slow, especially the housing estates under the housing society, such as Lokman Sanchun. Very often it takes up to 20 years to complete redevelopment. So how can the government speed up the redevelopment? Can we rehouse the residents first before we proceed to demolition and redevelopment? The redevelopment of old public housing estates is always a challenge because in a housing estate there are many households, so we must first seek to rehouse these families before we proceed to redevelopment. When we look at the redevelopment of many public housing estates, the rehousing must take place in stages, and that is why the process is time consuming. So we will explore how we can speed up the process. And in terms of transitional housing, we understand that in districts such as Kowloon City, there are sites that are temporarily left idle. Once we have a stable supply of public housing on the long run, the role of transitional housing would diminish. So I call for the support of residents in our work because we are trying to better support the inadequately housed. Mr. Chen Yong, followed by Ms. Doreen Kong. Am I coming through? Thank you. I wish you all good health, and we hope we can speed up housing production. I have a few points to make. We understand that housing production needs time. Many people propose short-term housing vouchers. Can we give priority to those who are on the waiting list? Is this something? Would you consider the futures or of pre-sold units, and you must remove barriers in terms of procedures? Can you further compress the construction timeline? And eventually we should raise the plot ratio, and we should see how we can further speed up the flow. There were earlier reports that the government intends to surrender private sites for public housing production, and 3 private sites would be taken. So I'd like to know what the progress and timeline look like for these 3 sites. Thank you very much. Secretary. Thank you. On housing construction in public housing, the plot ratio for housing could be increased to 30%. And in terms of the construction workflow, apart from the use of technology to enhance productivity, we will adopt the design and build procurement approach to speed up the workflow. We will also consider other options, and we welcome your views. In terms of taking back sites, I would invite Mr. Yao, the Deputy Secretary for Development, to explain the situation. Mr. Chen proposed a very innovative idea, that is the futures for pre-sold units. What would be the term of the futures? This is something worth considering, so perhaps we can have a chat on that later. Mr. Yao, thank you for the question. For the sites that would be surrendered to the government for public housing, the government has started the relevant procedures, and we are consulting relevant stakeholders. We will seek the formal approval of the CE in Council in taking back the land, and hopefully within this year the land could be returned to the HA or HS for public housing development. Mr. Chen, do you have anything to add? You still have some time. You have 20 seconds. Ms. Doreen Kong, followed by Ms. Dari Lee. Thank you. Good afternoon, Secretary. You said that in the next 10 years for PRH and GFS, there will be a total of 210,000 units. Of these units, what is the breakdown between PRH and GFS flats? You said that you face great difficulties in land production. Can you tell us specifically about the difficulties faced at different sites? That way we might be able to help you. If we do not even know what those challenges are at different sites, it would not be possible for us to give you suggestions on how barriers could be removed. In the annual progress report of the LTSS-HS, the recent report indicated a serious shortage of resources. How can the government provide more resources to the HA in terms of transitional housing? For projects already commenced, most transitional housing developments are located on government land. So would the use of these sites delay the construction of public housing or community facilities? So can you tell us about the original planned use of the relevant sites? Redevelopment of public housing estates often take decades. Would the government deploy dedicated staff or a team to redevelop public rental estates in order to vacate the relevant sites? In the next 10 years, the public housing target is 210,000 rental units and 91,000 SSFs. So altogether, we have 301,000. And in terms of transitional housing, for government sites originally earmarked for school development, if there's a delay in the development or in the timeline for school production, we might develop housing in the meantime. And most transitional housing are developed using MIC, and it's easy to demolish them. The annual progress report talked about the issue of resources. For the HA, we will reinforce our resources for the HA, and like we said, we would make best use of design and build procurement model to mobilize resources in the private market. Ms. Kong, anything to add? For land production, can you give us more details on the difficulties encountered at different sites? We really want to see how we can help you remove barriers. Thank you. Like we said, in the second 5-year period, we are now proceeding to statutory procedures for many sites, and each site is unique. Mr. Yao, do you have anything to add? Ms. Kong asked a very important question, and like the Secretary said, each site is unique. Hong Kong is a densely populated and highly developed city. To develop new land, when we proceed to studies, we would have to deal with different issues such as environmental and transport issues, and at the planning stage, we need to discuss with stakeholders how we go about the rezoning. And when it comes to land resumption, we need to consider the current residents and lot owners. So we need to deal with different stakeholders, and at different sites we would encounter different issues. So when it comes to the infrastructure construction, there are different factors to consider as well. Next, Ms. Starry Lee, followed by Mr. Dr. David Lam. Ms. Lee. And I'd like to talk about the housing production target under the LTHS. The government would say from time to time that the government's housing target fulfills the long-term housing strategy target, but the LTHS does not consider the goals of meeting the housing needs of young people and meeting the 3-year waiting time target. If such targets are not established, then the housing production level will not be able to address the real needs, and the situation could not improve on the long run. So I'd like to go back to the basics, that is what our objectives are. So Secretary, having heard the views of so many people and having realized the housing conundrum, can you incorporate the target of 3-year waiting time for PLH and satisfying the housing needs of young people as goals of the SAR government? For SDU tenants, can you share any information on what the current implementation progress is? At the previous term of LegCo, we talked about the idea of initial rent. Can you tell us about the progress?
Secretary, if I may defer to Mr. Chen first about the latest situation about tenancy control over SDUs, as well as our ideas about the initial rent. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary. If I may share some figures with you. On the 22nd of January, the amended ordinance came into effect. The Rating and Valuation Department provided hotlines, and through emails, letters, or counters, we received inquiries. As of the 28th of January, the RNV received 600 inquiries concerning tenancy control over SDUs. As a result of the amendment, there are new requirements, and newly signed tenancy agreements would have to be sort of referred to us by making use of a statutory form, so as to provide certain details to us. Now, of course, they've got 60 days as a grace period, but still, the RNV is in the process of receiving completed forms concerning newly signed tenancy agreements. We have got 6 district service teams so as to help the tenants and landlords at the district level in relation to the new requirements. For the service teams, they have been working via different channels. Say, for example, running a hotline via the WhatsApp. They've also got other means of receiving inquiries. Altogether, 300 calls have been received. The nature is similar to those received by the RNV, like people are interested in the new requirements, the tenure, as well as the transitional arrangements, and how the utilities charges are to be shared, and what about the restrictions on the rent increase. We have been receiving inquiries, and then the 6 district service teams have also been dealing with the following areas. Prior to the Chinese New Year, they had 23 street booths, and they had distributed 8,300 pamphlets. But then, as a result of the pandemic, they have now switched to the online mode. so as to carry out 4 online briefings. Sorry for such information. I'm sorry. We are running out of time. So for such information, please give the information in writing. What about the first question asked by Sterry Lee? Secretary, I give you 20 seconds. Yes, I also think that part is most important. Thank you, Ms. Lee, for your question. For Ms. Lee's question, yes, I know she is very concerned about that topic. That is the 3-year waiting time, saying goodbye to SDUs, youth home ownership. I think there was a reply to a written question at an electrical meeting. In the next 10 years, if we're able to achieve the supply target for the coming 10 years, then all the issues that you raised would be adequately dealt with. So your question has not been answered. Dr. Lam. Thank you, Chair. The Secretary talked about 5% of the newly completed public housing will be used for welfare purposes. Our population is aging and we need to develop primary health care. I think that's the focus of the government as well. So in future, when you talk about welfare institutions, are you going to provide daycare centers for the elderly so that they can age in place and age in the community? And then is it possible to develop a network of primary health care, not just about family doctors, not just about district health centers? I think we need local pharmacies and local healthcare programs for them. Secretary, in future, our public housing estates will be developed in such a way that there should be support, appropriate support to the people, like RHEs, residential and care homes for the elderly, as well as other welfare units. We do understand that there is such a demand, and we will take an overall view. We will liaise with other policy bureaus. So as far as the public housing estate is concerned, about 5% of the floor space will be dedicated to welfare purposes. Anything to add? No. Dr. Lam, any other questions? No. All right, thank you. Next, Mr. Tony Chair, and then Professor Lam. Thank you, Chair. For the housing supply for the coming 10 years, that would be done in accordance with the long-term housing strategy. Members and the public at large have been criticizing the government for this. You haven't got enough supply in the first 5 years, and you expect the shortfall to be made good by the production in the second 5 years. What about the past 5 years? I think you better give us the figures for the past 5 years so that the public have a clear idea about the housing production, covering both rental units as well as subsidized units for sale, so that we can tell whether you have delivered, and then we can tell whether you have really worked hard instead of just delaying the solutions. Secretary, of course, so many concerns about public housing as well as subsidized housing for sale. What about private housing? Do you have figures for the past 5 years? Was there an oversupply, or were the production figures in line with your targets? For the coming 10 years, for the first 5 years, you are not even delivering 1/3 of the expected production target. I just wonder if there would be an impact on the market. There is inadequate work for the workers currently, but then a few years down the road, there will be a labor shortage. for the $3.3 billion that you asked for, I think the CCF asked for $95 million. They haven't spent all the money. According to the paper, 700 units are available. So when we look at the unit cost for transitional housing, I think you deploy MIC methods. It seems that the case is very different. And what about getting hotels and guest houses to provide transitional housing? I just wondered if you can increase or enlarge the pool of transitional housing. Secretary, well, for private housing, for the 5 years since 2017-18, we have got a supply of 90,000 plus. When compared with 60,000 plus in the previous 5 years, we have got 30,000 more. That's a fact. In the coming 3-4 years, 98,000 units to be provided. So again, more than what we got in the past. This tells, it shows the achievement of the current term government. And then I can defer to my colleague for other questions. Secretary, can you provide more figures? That is, for the past 5 years, for the public units as well as the private units completed. Please provide written answer. Yes, I'll do so. Deputy Secretary, Undersecretary. $95 million came from the CCF, hoping to get 800 rooms from hotels and guest houses. We have given approval to 700 of them. As to the question of cost effectiveness, I think it is a matter of rental subsidies. For transitional housing, I think it's for a longer term. So the two schemes are different. But at the end of the day, we can carry out a review to see what we can do to improve upon it. I want to know about the cost effectiveness of the schemes. We planned to have 800 rooms in the first stage. When that is completed, we'll carry out an evaluation so as to lay the groundwork for the next stage. Will it be done this year? We will do it in due course. When? Under Secretary, when? What do you mean by in due course? We are still having 100 outstanding, so it won't be long. How come that he can't give us a timetable? Tony, I understand your question. We have overrun. You have overrun your time slot. Under Secretary, what do you mean by in due course? Within the year, which quarter of the year? Please give us an idea. Once we have finished with the outstanding number of units, we will embark on that. I'm confident that it will be carried out soon, in the near future. What do you mean by in the near future? Next month? It depends, because we have to talk to different stakeholders, and I cannot be sure about the timetable, but then I'm optimistic. If you're so optimistic, does it mean that you can get it done by next month? Secretary, it depends on whether the supply is adequate, and it depends on the response of the market. For this to be completed, it means that a hotel owner or a guest house operator is interested. When that is available, they will continue with the program. Secretary, I think you are most of the time giving us adjectives, qualifiers to our questions. Our time is precious, so I really hope that the administration will be more concrete in your answers. Professor Lam and myself will be the last two to ask questions. Let's hope that you can give us more concrete answers. Professor Lam.
林筱魯員
Mr. Andrew Lam, please switch on your microphone. Mr. Lam, please switch on your microphone. Thank you. Chairman, I have two questions. First, about the supply according to the LTHS. The target for the next 10 years is 300,000. I believe this projection is based on the current progress. Between 1999 and 2001, the total public housing supply was more than 190,000. 20 years on, our construction technologies have improved. I believe the climate and soil conditions would not change drastically. Can you explain why the current progress is so slow? If this is not due to technology or labor, what leads to such a drastic decline in housing production? I'd like to know where the problem lies. And I'd like to share some thoughts on transitional housing as well. A lot of advanced work is taken by NGOs, and we all know what the strengths of these NGOs are. They are not good at performing these advanced work. Why doesn't the government conduct the advanced work before handing over the other parts to the NGOs? The current funding level is based on the unit. So a one-person unit or five-person unit would receive the same level of funding. Most transitional housing units are for one or two-person households. And this might not be helpful in meeting the needs of bigger families. Many sites for transitional housing are located in remote areas, and there is inadequate transport and community support. So for residents living in these units, how can they afford the commuting costs? Would you provide further support in this regard, Secretary? Thank you very much. Whether for permanent housing or transitional housing, we face a major challenge, that is land supply. Mr. Lam is right in that most of the sites we identified are in the new territories or remote areas. Since land supply in urban areas are shrinking, many have been developed into different facilities already. So we need to speed up the progress in identifying land and land production. In terms of advanced work, our dedicated teams are working with the NGOs in transport impact assessment, environmental impact assessment, etc. We have done a lot behind the scenes, and before we take the projects to the Town Planning Board, internal consultation has been completed. That is why our work has largely been smooth. As for the cost of transitional housing, it is not based on the unit. There are different numbers of units with different sizes. For residents living in remote transitional housing units, the relevant teams would provide employment support, school transfer arrangements, etc. We have done a lot with NGOs on this. Earlier this year, a new transitional housing development, housing 1,800 residents, was completed, and the NGOs were able to support the residents. And hopefully we can continue to improve our work going forward. Now it's my turn. the 17 members before me asked some crucial questions of the THB. That is how we can speed up housing production, meet the 3-year waiting time target. The THB is also responsible for managing housing. We have more than 2 million people living in public housing. When the policy address was drafted, the 5th wave of the pandemic was yet to arrive, but now we are in the 5th wave. How can you safeguard the interests of these 2 million odd residents? Many housing estates have seen vertical transmission. A lot of lockdown orders were imposed at public housing estates. When you answer Mr. Tian's question, you said you completed the inspection of pipes and drainage systems, but still, at the 5th wave of the epidemic, we saw a lot of vertical transmission at public housing estates, and that imposed a burden on our anti-epidemic work. Is anti-epidemic work part of the responsibility of the THB? And many housing estates were subject to lockdowns, and a lot of offices did a lot. So at the housing department, are there dedicated staff to assess whether there are enough resources and manpower to deal with lockdown orders imposed at housing estates? Thank you. The housing authority has been doing their best in fighting the pandemic. At Kwai Chung Estate, there were lockdown orders of 5 days plus 2. In terms of the pipes, we did a lot during the pandemic. For all rental housing estates, we have completed the examination of all pipes. For that, I would defer to Mr. Luk and then Ms. Wang. Mr. Luk, perhaps I will talk about the pipes. And since October 2020, DHA started a scheme to inspect drainage pipes. As of January, we have inspected all the pipes. In other words, we visited all 8 TPRH units. For problematic pipes, they were immediately repaired. They made up a few percent of the total. Most pipes were in good health. In terms of vertical transmission, some cases were due to the fact that the housing estates were densely populated. As we all know, Omicron is highly transmissible in air, in the exhaust fans of bathrooms. If they are turned on, then there would be a negative pressure would develop in the bathroom, so air could be drawn from outside. And in those cases, disinfection was conducted and pipes were examined, and hopefully we could mitigate the transmission risks. In terms of our anti-epidemic work, since the 5th wave of the pandemic started at Kwai Chung Estate, we have done our best in complying with the lockdown orders imposed by the government. And whenever there were cases, we would reinforce hygiene, and we would also disinfect the toilets. And like Mr. Luk said, sometimes the Department of Health and Professor Yun would check for vertical transmission at housing estates, and we have provided our full support. For matters that could be dealt with upon drainage testing, they would be completed immediately. For issues that require long-term work, such as modification of pipes, then we would have to wait till the pandemic subsides. But for things that could be rectified immediately, they have been done. For the lockdown orders, we thank residents for their support, and hopefully we can play a part in curbing the pandemic. Secretary, since the fifth wave started, there were numerous lockdown orders. The HD staffs, cleaners, security workers, etc. have been working very hard. But I hope this Bureau and Housing Department can offer coordination to deploy adequate resources and manpower, especially at housing estates with an outbreak. So you need to provide better coordination. We have more than 2 million residents in public housing estates, so your work is crucial. So that's all for this item. A number of members are yet to have their questions answered since time is limited, but I see that many colleagues ask about subdivided units, transitional housing, etc. Hopefully, answers could be provided in writing after the meeting, including tenancy control on SDUs, review on using hotels and guest houses as transitional housing, the idea of initial rents for SDUs when a review would be conducted. Please provide answers in writing. Many members asked about the reasons for delays in different sites or developments. Members can specifically indicate the projects in question so the government can provide answers. Dr. Wong mentioned a few project delays, so hopefully the government can provide answers in writing, and if needed, we can discuss them at future meetings. So that's all for this item. Thank you very much. We talked about an injection of $3.3 billion for transitional housing. Do members support this proposal? Secretary, to be honest, this item is for members to offer their views on the policy address. The point you mentioned was a funding application. In Annex 5 of the paper, a funding application is mentioned, and the Secretary wants members to indicate whether we support this application. Since a funding application is involved, I would need to read out a declaration. If members have any direct or indirect pecuniary interest on the item to be discussed, please disclose the nature of such interest before you speak according to Rule 83A of the Rules of Procedure. Please also pay attention to voting arrangements in case of direct pecuniary interest under Rule 84. In terms of the funding proposal of injection for transitional housing, any views or objections? If not, members are deemed as supporting the item. We now enter the next item. To allow members to speak in an orderly and fair manner, please clear the raise hand markers of members. For members who intend to speak, please press the raise hand function in the Zoom system. I would invite members to speak in turn. Next item, HED 711 project number B087 084 TI public transport interchange at Tech Tin Street and associated road improvement works in Lam Tin. The meeting will be extended by 15 minutes. I now invite the government to walk us through the paper. They have a slideshow. Since time is limited, please be succinct as you speak. Who would take us through the slideshow?
Well, let's wait for the officials to settle down first because we have a change of team. Let me sort of read out the following. Please be reminded that if you have direct or indirect pecuniary interest regarding this discussion item, please, in accordance with 823A of the Rules of Procedure, disclose the nature of your interest before you speak. Please also note the requirements concerning voting in relation to Rule 84 of the Rules of Procedure when you do have direct pecuniary interest. Are the officials ready? Would it be Mr. Stephen Leung, DD of Housing, that will walk us through the paper? Yes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members. Good afternoon. I would like to spend a few minutes to briefly introduce the item B084TI, which is a public works program in relation to a public transport interchange at Tech Tin Street and associated road improvement works. I would like to brief you on the funding proposal, and then we will then go to the PWSC as well as the FC. Regarding the project B084TI, we would like to have a PTI so as to replace the open-air PTI at Tech Tin Street, and there should be a temporary reprovisioning of the public transport facilities before commissioning of the new PTI. There should be road improvement works at Tech Tin Street, Ping Tin Street, and On Tin Street. There will be parking spaces for motorcycles and other facilities. And then we'll be having associated works for the PTI, like regulator's office, drainage, public lighting facilities, fire services system, ventilation system, and environmental energy conservation measures in order to maintain the existing public transport service. At the early stage of this project, we have to temporarily reprovision the public transport facilities, and then we can demolish the open-air PTI and vacate the land for the public housing at Tech Tin Street as well as the new PTI. For our advanced work, please refer to the one shaded orange. We need to have a new access road so as to move all the or most of the bus lanes to the new one, and some of them will also go to another location. And then the minibus stop will go to Tech Tin Street. For that shaded blue, we have to relocate the facility to Ping Tin Street. And then you have an idea about what we have got in relation to Tech Tin Street, the open air PTI. And then we have the reprovisioned PTI. And then on the other side, we have the situation in Ping Tin Street. In order to provide more parking spaces, we're going to have lay-bys, metered parking spaces for private cars as well as motorcycles. On the right-hand side, upon completion of the road improvement works, you will have a different outlook. On the left-hand side, we have Hon Tin Street, where we have an international school. The road is narrow, and then during the busy hours, we have a lot of curbside activities, and therefore we have traffic congestion. Therefore, we would like to provide a lay-by so as to avoid vehicles taking up the space of the carriageway when they have to set down passengers. So please refer to the photo on the right-hand side. A word about the project estimate. It will cost us about $104.4 million. As to the breakdowns, please take a look of the PowerPoint. We are going to submit a discussion paper to the PWSC. We'll then be more detailed about the various elements. We may have to make fine-tunements. We may have to fine-tune the individual items. In May 2020, in relation to the project, we consulted the Housing Planning and Lands Committee of Kwun Tong District Council, and the Housing Department responded to members' concerns about the support facilities. On the 22nd of January 2021, the project was gazetted. 5 objections were received. Mainly speaking, they were concerned about the traffic impact, and they were concerned about the impact on the nearby schools. We have explained the details to the objectors. The Chief Executive in Council on the 7th of December 2021 authorized the proposed works without modification. The notice of authorization was subsequently gazetted on the 21st of January 2022. With the approval of the FC, we plan to start work in the middle of 2022. To tie in with the commencement work, we are going to invite tenders in parallel, and the project is expected to be completed in 2027. Upon consulting the housing panel today, we will soon go to the PRC as well as the FC for their approvals. Thank you. A number of members would like to speak. Tony Chair, Chen Hock-Fong, and An Man-Yu. So again, 4 minutes each for both Q&A. Mr. Tony Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, for the existing open-air PTI, as well as the proposed PTI, I want to know how many buses and minibuses can be accommodated. Now that you're going to spend this amount of money, are you going to enhance the facilities to benefit the public? So when it comes to the design, have you considered improving the service provided to the public? And then it will take us 5 years to complete the project, and then the open PTI will be provisioned to 2 different places. So what will happen to the 2 reprovisioning sites upon completion of the new PTI? Will they still be used for public transport purposes, like minibus stops? Who can take the questions? Mr. Leung. Thank you, Mr. Chair. In relation to the comparison of the facilities, it will be the same. We are not going to scale down the service. No, Chair. We are going to spend a lot of money. So why won't they take the opportunity to enhance the service? It seems that there won't be any improvement and no progress. No, Mr. Chair. Let me talk about the number of bus routes using the PTI. It will be the same. As to whether it is going to benefit the public, currently it is an open-air PTI. Upon completion of the project, about half of the PTI will be covered. We believe that on the on the ceiling of the PTI, we can have some sound-absorbing materials, and then its impact on the surrounding area will be minimized. We've also got other facilities, like we have got a childcare center with 100 places above the PTI, and we have also got 460 housing units above the PTI. I'm mainly concerned about the PTI. Now we're going to reprovision the bus terminus. It will go to Pington Street. And then there are parking spaces. There will be metered parking spaces. That's something new. and then we are sort of rationalizing the parking spaces. It will be easier for the public. And then there will be a lay-by in Painting Street. And then near the International School, again, there will be a lay-by so as to help with the curbside activities. There are also other road improvement works, say, for example, at Painting Street. Chair, I think my time slot is running out. We are going to spend so much money. It seems that the capacity will remain the same, but we do anticipate a growth in the traffic volume. Now, by covering part of the PTI, probably you can reduce the noise pollution, but then the improvement is too minor. Now, the government is going to spend money. I think the government should think hard. We can't just be sort of conservative and try to reprovision it in situ. I think you have to maximize the space available. Yes, understand that it is a matter of multi-uses on a single site. So to me, I don't like it because it is like sort of being a routine sort of project. Well, members are raising their hands. So if you want to ask questions, do indicate your wish by pressing the raise hand button. And I have to draw a line. Mr. Chen Hofeng to be followed by Mr. An Man-yu. Thank you, Chair. Well, one single public housing block will be put up. Yes, I know it is difficult to find space for public housing. I won't object to it. But everybody knows that we have already got 130,000 people living there. If you are to have an additional block, then it will become more crowded and it will add to the traffic volume. So has the government considered the following? That is, what are you going to do to make sure that the traffic congestion won't result? Whenever we have new facilities or whenever you have a new housing block, you must make sure that you increase the traffic capacity. Otherwise, if you simply reprovision the facility, naturally you won't get local support. I agree with Tony Chair. That is, it is really too expensive, costing us $100 million. If we are spending that amount of money, I think we expect more, say having more support measures, having footbridges, taking us to different destinations to facilitate the accessibility of the pedestrians. And then we have got schools in the vicinity. During the construction phase, you may be causing nuisance to the nearby schools. And what is your sort of solution? Didi, for the traffic impact, we did carry out a TIA. That is, with this facility, what will happen to the local traffic? We have road improvement works, and the impact should be minimized. As to the accessibility on the part of pedestrians, with this new PTI, the TD will also rationalize the services there. Say, for example, reconsidering the bus routes that will be serving this location. When the project is near completion, then the TD will take care of this matter. Mr. Chair and Mr. Chen asked whether further improvements can be carried out. Yes, we'll revisit the topic to see what else can be added. As to the nuisance or the impacts during the construction phase, we are going to have two stages. We are not going to do it in one go, so there will be two phases. First, the first phase, which means that we are going to temporarily reprovision the existing PTI so that the existing site will be vacated for the second stage. For the area outside the international school, there will be a lay-by. This is because we don't want to have too many projects underway at the same time to avoid the sort of cumulative effects. So by splitting it into two stages, the nuisance can be minimized. We know that there are schools and there are also people residing there. So during the construction stage, we'll be liaising closely with the schools. We'll be bearing in mind and being sensitive to the examination period, and we'll ask the contractors to talk to schools to see whether the contractors can sort of stagger the timetable. And then for dust and other nuisance, of course the contractor has to meet the statutory requirements. And then for noise pollution, perhaps they can use noise barriers to avoid causing an impact on the school operations. Mr. Chen, anything else? No? Sorry, your time has just run out.
下一位係顏文。
Next, Mr. Ngan Menyu, followed by Mr. Lee Chen Kang. Thank you. Chairman, I'm also a district councillor of Kwun Tong, and I'd like to share some of the residents' concerns. First, for the Deputy Director. According to the paper, it will house a population of 520, and most of them are units for singletons. I understand these are designed for the elderly, and yet you also have a child care center instead of a daycare elderly center or elderly support center. I'd like to know the reason why. I see that a single story or single block design is adopted. What kind of public housing would that be? I'd like to know whether there will be parking spaces. If there are no parking spaces, then do people have to compete for metered parking spaces? Deputy Director, thank you. I agree with Mr. Ngan's observation. Most of these units are designed for 1 or 2 person households. These are not necessarily elderly people. For the child care center, we asked the SWD what their requirements are, and they agree that it's appropriate to establish a child care center here to serve the community. As for the single block design, our plan is to develop it as public rental housing, but there's a flexibility to switch to HOS if necessary. In terms of parking spaces, according to the Hong Kong Planning Census and Guidelines, no car park needs to be provisioned. But in light of future needs, we will provide a loading, unloading area as well as parking spaces for visitors in a coming Ping Tin Street development. It will be provided. This is a very small construction site. If we are to provide parking spaces, the development timeline would be affected. Thank you. I have great reservations at this answer. We're talking about 520 people. It's not possible that none of them drive a car. Lam Tin Estate has no parking spaces for visitors either. I understand the provisions in the HAPSG. So is the housing department assuming that no one in the entire housing estate would drive? Some of them could be professional drivers. It's unrealistic to not provide any parking spaces. If this is developed as a public housing estate, how do you manage a single block building? If these are subsidized or subsidized housing, would the management fees be very high? I hope you can answer my questions. Deputy Director, thank you very much for the questions. In terms of parking spaces for visitors, they are provided, but not at the Tuck Tin Street. At the Ping Tin Street site, we will provide the 5 spaces requisite. in terms of management for public rental housing, we could either work with the adjacent estates or consider other approaches. We will work with our property management team. Mr. Lee Chen-kang. Thank you. I'd like to address what Mr. Ngan and Mr. Chair said. I welcome the construction of more public rental housing units. But did you consider holistic planning for Pingtin Street? You said you were asking people to walk some way after parking their car. So is 5 enough? The growth of vehicles exceed the provision of parking spaces. The ratio is now 1 to about 1.0 something. The shortage would lead to heightened demand on parking spaces. So when can people park their cars? I don't know whether we have dual carriage way lanes at Tuck-in Street and On-tin Street. Hopefully you can do a better job in transportation. In terms of single site, multiple uses, can you provide a car park at basement level and facilitate wheelchair users? Thank you very much for the questions. As to whether 5 parking spaces are adequate, according to Hong Kong planning standards and guidelines, the minimum requirement is 5. But as to whether more parking spaces can be introduced at Pingtin Street, this is something we would look at. Mr. Lee talked about the idea of developing the basement. We can see that the construction site is actually very small. Half is occupied by the bus stop. The other half is for the loading and unloading bay, and there are lots of E&M plant rooms and exits. If we are to build a basement, we need vehicular access, and construction would take a lot longer. And that is why we want to expedite the timeline. Mr. Lee asked whether we would review the Pingtin Street project to introduce more parking spaces. This is something we can think about. It's about whether there's vision. You don't even have parking spaces for taxis or professional drivers nearby. So where can people park their cars at night? And people just park their cars randomly, and that leads to more congestion. By making use of technology, you can improve the development workflow. So hopefully the Deputy Director can think about that. So that's all for this agenda item. So our colleagues change the view back to gallery view, and I now consult members whether you support the government's proposal to submit this proposal to the Public Works Subcommittee. Next item, any other business? Barring any other business, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.